We recently completed an audit of traffic enforcement in King County. Traffic stops are the third most common patrol action taken by officers countywide, with officers initiating approximately 62,000 stops between 2019 and 2021. My name is Justin Anderson, and our audit looked at traffic stops across King County. Along with Grant Dailey, we'll be sharing three key takeaways from the report. First, the types and circumstances of traffic stops differ across the county's different service areas. Second, the King County Sheriff's Office lacks sufficient strategies for traffic safety. And third, we share information about traffic enforcement alternatives other jurisdictions are exploring. As Grant and I review the report, you'll see the icon shown here as we walk through each section. I want to start with a quick conceptual discussion about traffic stops. Nationally, traffic stops are the most common police-public interaction, and there are basic factors in any given traffic stop. The first is the reason for the stop. Traffic stop can be for criminal investigation, when an officer stops a car related to a crime. This can be from a 911 call or something the officer sees. And then there's traffic enforcement, stopping drivers for violations like speeding or expired tabs. These are almost always self-initiated by officers. Officer discretion can be a factor in traffic stops. In many instances, officers can choose whether to make a stop or not. And also, in some places nationally, officers can use some types of traffic enforcement stops as a pretext for criminal investigation. Pretext stops are not allowed in Washington. I'll talk about this a bit more later. And any traffic stop carries some level of risk. The purpose and circumstance of a stop affect that risk, but all stops have some risk. During the audit, we asked Sheriff's Office officers if those risks could be quantified in advance, and they said no. Any given stop presents risks because you don't know how the interaction will go. So thinking about risk holistically, there's officer safety, obviously, but there's also the risk to everyone from cars stopping on the side of a busy roadway, the risk of potential bias, negative community outcomes. No one enjoys getting pulled over. The Sheriff's Office identifies their goal for traffic stops as improving traffic safety through reducing impaired and unsafe driving and also reducing, that is preventing, collisions. So logically, they'd want to evaluate their operations, their traffic stops, relative to traffic safety. And since traffic stops have risks, they should balance those risks against their objectives. In simple terms, this means assessing the intended safety benefits of the traffic stops they conduct. But we found that's not really happening consistently across the Sheriff's Office. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to switch gears for a second and walk through what's been happening with the Sheriff's Office's traffic stops over the past few years. The audit looked at computer-aided dispatch, or CAD, data over the last 3 years, 2019 through 2021. And across the Sheriff's Office, the number of traffic stops has been declining since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the second quarter of 2020, they have not had a quarter that reaches the previous number of stops before COVID. Among the areas the Sheriff's Office serves, some have dedicated traffic enforcement units. The types of areas the Sheriff's Office serves can be loosely divided into three groups: unincorporated King County, shown in green; contract partners that have dedicated traffic enforcement, shown in yellow; and contract partners without them, shown in orange. I'll briefly note that Metro and Sound Transit are not included on this map. The 6 contract partners with traffic units are listed on the map, and all of them have either motorcycle officers or patrol cars focused primarily on traffic enforcement. To be clear, this doesn't mean that there is no traffic enforcement outside these cities. All patrol officers still make traffic stops to enforce traffic violations. But there is a clear split reflected in the data in operations between the areas that have traffic enforcement units and those that do not. This chart shows the rate of speeding stops over the last 3 years for the Sheriff's Office. The yellow line shows the number of speeding stops per month for the 6 cities with traffic enforcement units, and the green and orange lines show the numbers for unincorporated and non-traffic cities, respectively. Simply put, cities with traffic enforcement conduct most of the speeding stops in comparison with the other contract partners in unincorporated King County. Now let's talk about traffic stops and traffic enforcement. Comparing the risks and benefits of traffic stops is best practice. Law enforcement should identify their traffic safety objectives and then focus their traffic enforcement operations, the traffic stops they conduct, in light of those objectives. And they should do so using location-based data. So for example, an agency could look at speed measuring devices or collision data to decide where to focus speeding enforcement. These approaches often link road engineers and law enforcement around safety-related data. That is, they decide traffic enforcement among a range of options to increase state safety. The Sheriff's Office includes guidance in their General Orders Manual that reflects these concepts, data reporting and meeting with the county traffic engineer, for example. In simple terms, the Sheriff's Office should be able to describe how the stops they're making serve their larger traffic safety goal. As I noted, some contract partners have traffic enforcement units. This means that those cities have made contractual and operational decisions to have dedicated traffic enforcement resources. And during the audit, we found that those partners followed best practice, albeit in ad hoc ways. City leaders and Sheriff's Office chiefs and officers explained how they link their work on the street, the traffic stops they make, to their city's traffic safety needs, and how they identified those needs through various means like public complaints, speed devices, and accident locations. However, comparatively, Sheriff's Office leaders could not, despite the guidance in their General Orders Manual. For example, they don't presently coordinate with the Road Services Division in identifying strategies in unincorporated areas. Road staff noted that the last time they'd partnered with the Sheriff's Office in providing accident location data was in 2018. They also don't coordinate with their contract partners regarding overall traffic safety goals. In turn, this means that the Sheriff's Office is not able to fully assess their traffic stops relative to traffic safety. For example, Sheriff's Office leaders and officers noted they shun pretext stops, and nationally, a common type of these stops are defective equipment stops, that is, fix-it tickets. The CAD data show the proportion of these stops is almost twice as high in unincorporated areas than in the areas with traffic enforcement units, yet Sheriff's Office leaders could not articulate why that would be the case. Unincorporated area officers conduct less traffic enforcement and make fewer traffic stops, but their limited resources don't mean they're not conducting traffic stops. So in simple terms, the Sheriff's Office has set traffic safety as a goal, but does not have objectives that operationalize or measure reaching that goal. This means they cannot show the balance in risks versus benefits explained earlier. Hence our first two recommendations. Our first recommendation is that the Sheriff's Office needs to identify and set objectives for traffic enforcement and develop strategies for how they can assess their operations, even considering their limited resources. And our second recommendation is for the Sheriff's Office to coordinate with their contract partners and roads to make sure they're all on the same page regarding their traffic enforcement operations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Grant Dailey.
Thank you, Justin. For the record, Grant Dailey with King County Auditor's Office. And as Justin mentioned, contract partners oversee their own traffic enforcement priorities at the local level. While this is not necessarily a cause for concern, a lack of regular county-wide assessment presents a risk that some of the very traffic practices could be inconsistent with county goals. However, the Sheriff's Office does not have the data it needs to mitigate or even identify such risks. This is a concern because nationwide, studies have shown that racial disparities in traffic stops are a widespread issue. Based on these studies, current best practice in traffic enforcement is to collect and consider demographic information for every stop. 23 states, including Washington, have passed laws requiring the collection of demographic data during traffic stops in order to ensure that racial profiling does not occur. However, the Sheriff's Office does not collect race data for all traffic stops to assess these risks county-wide. The limited cases where race data is available shows disparities. Currently, when an officer conducts a traffic stop, they will enter demographic information for warnings and citations into a statewide system. However, this system is maintained by Washington State Patrol and is not continually monitored by the Sheriff's Office. There are limited situations where the Sheriff's Office does maintain demographic information itself. For example, if a traffic stop results in a use of force. This amounts to 0.04% of traffic stops, or a total of 42 uses of forces between 2019 and 2021, meaning a large portion of traffic stops do not have demographic information in the Sheriff's Office system. And among the stops which do involve a use of force and therefore have demographic information, we found that white officers were 2.5 times more likely to use force against a Black motorist than people of other races. However, there is not enough information to determine the potential causes of these disparities, nor how widespread they are, if similar disparities exist in other traffic interactions. More comprehensive data collection during traffic stops and analysis of that data could provide the additional detail needed to identify and address potential bias in traffic stops. In alignment with state law, our report recommends that the Sheriff's Office collect perceived demographic data for each traffic stop, regardless of the purpose or the outcome. This recommendation is made in alignment with recommendation 3 from our report and our previous presentation on calls for service, which addresses the analysis of this collection of data in order to identify and mitigate any potential causes for disparity. As we mentioned earlier, the Sheriff's Office indicates safety as the primary goal for traffic enforcement in King County. And across the United States, traffic enforcement strategies are also being adjusted to further emphasize safety. Decision makers could look to these strategies as frameworks for change in King County if desired. These changes fall into 3 major categories: changes in law or policy to reduce the reasons officers can initiate traffic stops, the creation of a civilian traffic enforcement agency, and the implementation of automated traffic enforcement. In order to emphasize safety and equity, areas across the country are implementing changes to the laws and policies for traffic enforcement. Some jurisdictions are limiting traffic stops to only enforce items that present immediate threats to public safety. For example, stops would not occur for things such as noise violations, expired tabs, or tinted windshields. And there are many paths to these changes if desired. For example, Philadelphia made changes to local ordinance, Virginia amended state law, and the City of Seattle updated its department policy. Since many traffic infractions in Washington are determined at the state level, changes to state law that would have prohibited similar types of stops were proposed during the 2021 and 2022 regular legislative session. However, these changes did not pass. In King County, any desired changes to traffic stop policy would therefore require changes to local ordinance and to department policy, or future proposals for changes to state law. Any changes would have to take into consideration or collaborate with the Sheriff's Office contract partners as they set enforcement priorities at the local level. Jurisdictions are also exploring the creation of non-police agencies to conduct traffic enforcement, but each face barriers in state law and the efforts remain in the early stages of development. In these jurisdictions, non-police agencies would conduct some activities previously completed by sworn police officers. For example, parking enforcement, collision investigation, and traffic control. However, in states such as California, Minnesota, and Massachusetts, state law only allows sworn police officers to conduct traffic stops. As a result, the City of Berkeley, California is lobbying to change state law and has indicated that transitioning these duties to non-police agencies may trigger collective bargaining. In Washington, the state law defines some terms related to traffic enforcement, but the definitions are vague. For example, state law mentions traffic enforcement officers, but it doesn't clearly say if this term means a sworn police officer. Additionally, infraction rules define a citing officer as a law enforcement officer or other officer that is authorized by law. As such, the creation of civilian-led traffic agencies would likely first require a change to state law. Finally, automated enforcement strategies such as traffic cameras can be effective, but they raise concerns about equity, excessive fines, and data privacy. The most common automated traffic enforcement tools are red light and speed tracking cameras. Some of the trade-offs of these tools are listed on the slide. For example, they've been credited as effective methods to increase safety, but when implemented hastily or without thorough consideration, these strategies can have disparate impacts on communities of color. These adverse impacts could be mitigated by adjusting where they are placed or by reducing maximum fines and ensuring that fines do not result in a loss of license. In total, automated enforcement strategies are legal in Washington state and could be effective tools to increase safety. But equity and privacy concerns, as well as the preferences of the Sheriff's Office contract partners, could present barriers to widespread implementation. Additionally, the Road Services Division has previously recommended against implementation based on the equity and community concerns they've received. In summary, our audit found that traffic stops vary depending on the area being served, that the Sheriff's Office lacks measurable objectives to track its progress towards meeting its traffic safety goal and to ensure that profiling does not occur. And lastly, alternative strategies to traffic enforcement from across the United States could serve as examples for future change in King County. And that concludes our presentation.